Okay, it is 7 o'clock on the dot. Welcome to Alignment Vision Action on Fireside. I am your host, Laurel Rutledge, and I am so excited to have my guest, Ash Merchant, here again, who is the founding partner and owner of Lionheart Partners. And all things guru in leadership. And so we are going to have another phenomenal conversation about showing up and leadership and brand and all that good stuff. And so I'm so excited to have you here, Ash. Thank you, thank you, thank you for being here. And you guys can catch all of his bio and how to get in touch with him in the show notes that you'll see on this show in the replay. Ash, thank you for coming.
Laurel, such a great pleasure to be here, and I appreciate you having me on again.
Yes, I am. I've been so looking forward to this conversation, and and in respect for time, because like to have the replay ready for people. We're going to just dive in, and as folks come onto the show, we'll just jump them in on the stage and everything. And Jenny's watching all that for us. So Jenny, my lovely producer. So, oh, good evening, Woody. Thank you for joining the show. So, Ash, we had a conversation in the green room and we were talking about leadership and showing up and brand and how you do that. And one of the things that you do all the time with your clients is really talk about this building relationships to get business results. Like as leaders, how do you build these relationships? And so we had this conversation about how not only is it the relationship you build with like your team or you build with maybe your colleagues that are lateral to you or even the people that you work for, but also the relationships you build with people who might represent you or who you might represent outside of the organization. So maybe let's dive in there and say, what is the crux of what you tell people when you start with, look, getting results is about building relationships?
Laurel, there's so much on that, and I'll say this: that we grew up in a time, and I'll pick on my age and
Yes,
and yours as well. That we grew up
yes,
in an era and in a generation where we paid much closer attention to organizational charts. Kind of who reported to
yes.
who and who was on top and who owned departments and functional things and things like that. The reality is, in today's business climate, we're actually building more networks than we are necessarily paying attention to org charts. And what I mean by that is, think of our relationships as this patchwork quilt. We're
Hmm.
just putting together different patches on a quilt, and we are developing relationships horizontally. We're developing relationships vertically as well, whether they're in your function or whether you're not in
Hmm.
that function. There's so much influence without direct authority that happens in business today,
Yes.
whether you're in a small business or you're in a large corporation
Hmm.
or in a nonprofit or anything like that. There's just so much that's hinging on relationships. One of the terms that I use with my clients and with the folks that I have an opportunity to teach and
Hmm.
coach is this value of relational currency. We think about
Yes.
currency in terms of foreign currency. We think of it as the value of currency goes up and down based on just what's happening in the climate, what's happening in politics, how people are viewing fear or optimism or anything like
Hmm.
that. Relational currency is no different, Laurel. When I come
Yeah.
to you, I have to not only be trading in valuable currency, but I have to trade in a currency that's going to be relevant to you. So if you are
Yes.
someone that is more analytical or if you are someone that is more relational, I have to make sure that I match my currency to what you value. Otherwise, there's not any trading going on. There's not any trust being
Yeah.
built. There's not any sharing of information or perhaps even effective collaboration happening.
See, I love that relational currency. And you said, as you talk about building these relational networks, because we don't think about just up anymore. And I talk to people about that all the time. I'm like, it's not a career path, it's a career flow. I heard that from one of the chief human resources officers at Marathon Oil years ago. It's like we talk to people about career flow. I'm like, that's so good because it's not just a straight line. And it's the same thing with networks. And in that network, that whole idea of yes, you got mentors, but more important, you have advocates and sponsors. And you might not even know who a sponsor is because those are the people who are in rooms where decisions are made. And you
So
may
true.
not even know your name is being brought up, right? So when you talk about these networks that people build, How do you help them understand kind of the power of not only building your network, but intentionally building your network?
You hit a key word right there, is intentionally and thoughtfully, because we are
Hmm.
running so fast right now in business globally. We are just, it seems like we are running so hard and
Hmm.
trying to get so much done. And this was happening pre-COVID, and
Yeah.
COVID became an accelerant for this kind of behavior. And unfortunately, a negative accelerant in the way
Hmm.
that, whatever little margin, or I have a partner who refers to it as whatever air we had in our calendar got taken out, and we didn't
Right.
build air back into the calendar to even have
Right.
margin to intentionally and thoughtfully develop relationships. I mean, pre-COVID, it was easy to build some of these informal networks because we would be walking down the hall and, hey, I could stick my head in Laurel's office, spend 5 minutes with her, perhaps even bat around
Hmm.
a business issue if I wasn't even just connecting with her relationally. Well, all of a
Right.
sudden, now if I want to connect with Laurel, I have to schedule a 15-minute Teams call and pray that my technology is going to work and my every other word's not going to be, and
Right.
worry about whether we're going to have any kind of relational connection there. So some of that
Yes.
was really put on ice during COVID. And I would tell you, I was with a client this morning, and we were just talking about this
Hmm.
idea of there's no substitute for in-person interaction like that. And it
Yeah.
doesn't always have to be about business, but
Right.
oftentimes some of the best mentoring and business solving issues and solving problems happens in
Hmm.
minutes, not in hours. And
Yes.
that comes
Yes.
from just being intentional and thoughtful about, hey, maybe I just need to spend 10 minutes with somebody in supply chain just to understand that function a little better.
Right.
Or maybe the
Right.
person in sales can give me a more frontline view of, okay, how does it
Hmm.
really sound with our customers, so that I can
Yes.
appreciate, relationally where they're coming from, but then I can also build currency with them. So if they see me walking down the hall, they're thinking, great, here he comes. He actually gets us versus, oh
Yes.
no, here he comes. He doesn't get us at all, and we're going to waste time if we spend with him.
Right, right. Well, and you tap. So I'm going to throw you a curveball, Ash, because you said something that really taps into something I saw a few weeks ago. This whole idea of FaceTime, right? Like in person time.
Yeah.
And so one of the people that I love him. Everything he puts out, everything he said, and that's Malcolm Gladwell. Love it.
Mm-hmm.
And he stirred up like a hornet's nest of controversy a few weeks ago saying, okay, it's time. Everybody needs to be back in the office. Just this is ridiculous. Just come back to the office. I'm paraphrasing, right? People lost their minds. They're like, what is wrong with him? He's tone deaf. What are you talking about? Which is so unusual in many ways for Malcolm Gladwell. On the other hand, he does have a tendency to challenge the norms. And if you read more, then he'll go back and say, well, this is why, right? Thinking this process. So when you said, we've lost something, which I agree in some level, right? We've lost something by not having that. I can just go down the hall, I can just get out of my office, I can just go see somebody really quick. It's just a quick meeting. I can, even though I can see body language, thank goodness we did have this technology. If COVID was going to hit, right, we could at least have face to face. We have this, but it's still not the same as that connection that happens, because we are beings, And so there's that connection of just being in the same space. As you were talking about building these relationships, right, and this controversy now of in office, not in office. How are you telling people or helping people, not just telling? How are you assisting
Yeah.
your clients in continuing to build relationships that are hybrid relationships? Some people just are never going to come back. They just aren't, but they might be critical to your network. How are you helping people kind of give grace to each other around that, but also still build intentional, real relationships in this hybrid world?
So it's a great question, and Gladwell really did step in it when he put that out several weeks ago.
Yeah.
What was interesting though is that part of the reason why he stepped in it is because we operate in a society that deals with sound bites, and people saw
Yes.
they saw a very short clip of it, but
Exactly.
when you actually contextualized what he said, there were some nuggets in there. There were some interesting nuggets in
Yes.
there, and some
Yes.
nuggets of wisdom in there. Now, I do
Mm-hmm.
believe that the world of hybrid work is here, and it is
Yes.
not going away. And that I don't think that's a bad thing
Right.
in and of itself. It's not a bad thing. Where I think people have gotten sideways on this is when you go to be 100% remote, and if your organization, whoever you work for, doesn't make it just irresistibly intentional to come back, not 5 days a
Yes.
week necessarily, but if certain
Yeah.
days of the week, whatever those are, I mean, Apple came out, you saw their,
Yeah.
RTO policy was 3 days a week. And you would have thought, Tim Cook just,
Yes.
caused
Blew the
rioting in
world
the
up. I
streets,
know. Yes.
which
Yes.
is, but again, it was. I think each company and each organization is going to have their own culture. I mean, I was working with a
Mm-hmm.
company pre-pandemic that had a purely distributed workforce. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
100%
Mm-hmm.
remote. Everybody was
Yeah.
before COVID, and what I saw them do though was they would have team meetings. Now, granted, this was an organization that had probably no more than about 40 or 50 people, so the
Right.
culture and the
Mm-hmm.
vibe was a little bit different. They'd
Right.
host meetings in different cities where they had large pockets of employees, and they built that esprit de
Mm-hmm.
corps and just that sort of sense of
Yeah.
belonging in there. I think that's where relationally where people are struggling right now is if
Mm.
I'm dealing with a team that is remote, or if it either refuses to come in or we've just allowed them to be remote, having a sense of belonging to the team is already handicapped on that, because if I'm not physically in,
Actually,
if
I
I'm
don't
not
think.
physically in,
Yeah, I don't think it was just you, Ash. So we'll cut this part out because my I froze too. That was weird. Okay, go ahead.
okay, yeah. So what I was saying is that you've got people that are, um, on one hand they want to work remotely. On the
Yeah.
other hand, when it comes to dealing with the trade-off of what does informal interaction do? Whether it's we're able to collaborate better, whether there's some quick
Yes.
mentoring opportunities, that's a pretty heavy trade-off. And I think the trade-off is actually for our youngest colleagues around Gen Z and Gen Y. I mean, millennials, the younger
Yes.
millennials and Gen Z are truly at a disadvantage because those are the pockets of people who need to get onboarded and advocated for and have this
Yes.
allyship that you are talking about. Whereas if I'm a Gen Xer, which I carry the banner proudly, you and
Me
I
too.
have talked about this before. We have been vilified as the bitter generation, but
Yes.
I will carry that flag forever.
Yes.
So
Yes.
what
Yes.
we we actually know how to deputize others to advocate on our behalf. And I'm not saying other people don't. That sounds very elitist to say
Right.
that. But
Yeah.
as you get older, as you're a baby boomer or a Gen X or anything like that, you kind of it's not about working the system, but it's about just being, when you talk about showing up and then
Yeah.
connecting dots and making,
Yes.
sometimes people get sideways on on this concept because they feel like,
Yeah.
I don't want to be too political, or I don't want to be putting people out, or
Right.
I'm just going to be viewed as a brown nose or all this other
Yeah.
nonsense. And I think politics in its literal form, if you truly
Yeah.
are politicking and you're not really adding value to relationships, that's off-putting. Nobody likes that.
Right. Right.
But if you are thoughtfully and intentionally and perhaps even assertively asking for introductions and connections, and
Yes.
the question that I always like to pose for people that deal with, when you're dealing with other organizations or if you're dealing
Hmm.
with external service providers,
Right.
the question I pose to them is, who else should I be meeting in your organization? Who else should I get to know? It's a
Right.
golden question inside of a company. It's an even better question when you're a service provider providing to an organization. That's how
Agreed.
introductions happen.
Yeah.
That's how,
It's the
who
connection.
are the people that I need to be spending time with
Yeah.
intentionally.
Agreed. Agreed. Oh shoot, we lost Frankie. So hopefully they'll come back. He sent me a note that his phone was freezing,
Oh,
but he
no
was
worries.
trying to come back. Yeah, so we'll
Okay.
hopefully he'll be able to come back in. Yeah, I agree, Ash. It is. We often take so many words and misconstrue and misuse the words so that they become ugly, like politics. Political savvy is important. Political savvy is important. And using your political savvy is masterful and genius, right? It's important for you to know how to do that.
For
It's
sure.
not that creating relationships and creating networks and understanding who you're working with and all of that. It's not a bad thing. It's to your point. It's how you use it and what is your intent that causes the challenge. If your intent is nefarious, then we have an issue.
Yeah,
If your
or if it's
intent is nefarious,
manipulative,
yes,
or if it's trying to game something or anything like that. And I
yes,
think people are smart enough and savvy enough to snuff that out
yes,
usually.
yes,
And I would say that people that have to feel like they have to operate like that,
yes,
the last thing you want is a reputation that that person's not authentic or they're just not genuine. Uh, and
exactly.
and that, I mean, if anything was taught during COVID was this importance of showing authenticity and vulnerability and
Yes,
genuineness in leadership.
yes, yes,
And
exactly.
without that, it's just you're always guessing. Well, wait a minute, what's she really like? What's he really like? Is that
Yeah.
and you never want to have. I have a friend of mine locally here who's written about this topic. He's a former pastor, and he's written about this topic called, what's it? He poses this question of what are
Mm-hmm.
you known for? What are you known
Mm-hmm.
for? What do you want to be
Mm-hmm.
known for? And we're really kind
Mm-hmm.
of at the heart of a reputation here. And I
Right.
love his follow on question to that is, what's it like to be on the other side of me?
Yes,
And
that's good.
it's such a cool question because, and
Yeah.
you have to you I asked my wife this question a couple few months ago, and I was a little worried. I was like, oh, am I just pulling a pin on a
I'm gonna
grenade here?
say, yeah, yeah, right.
And I tell people this. I said, listen, start with your team at work before you start nosing
Yeah.
around in your family for this answer.
Start
Because
in the safe place. Who knew that work would be the safe place
that's
for that
right.
question? But it
But
is.
it is so funny because when we
Yeah.
talk about how do you show up and how
Yeah.
do people show up, uh,
Hmm.
how folks answer that question is such a reflection of how you show up.
Yes.
Where
Yes.
you
Yeah.
invest your time, what kind of words you use, what kind of,
Hmm.
we talk about this concept about love languages and, words of affirmation or,
Right.
physical touch or acts of
Hmm.
service and different things like that. I mean, that's all in how people show up, whatever that is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, what we often don't talk about, we a girlfriend and I did some work at a school. It was a college prep school, and we were talking to them about a number of things. And one of the things we talked to them about was, that we really just wanted them to be aware, right? We wanted them to pay attention to how they shook hands, how they address someone. We wanted them to pay attention to their wardrobe. We wanted them to actively listen. We wanted them to make eye contact, right? Because what people I think forget is that we talk a lot about brands, and you think Coke and Pepsi and Gatorade and Under Armour and Nike and all of these kind of things. And we talk about brand and brand management and how people's brands get demolished with things every once in a while. They do something really stupid, like because again, Gen X, I remember the Tylenol problem, right?
Oh,
When
sure,
Tylenol
sure.
got, oh, that was just horrendous. Or Enron, right? I was there. I saw people walking out with their boxes at Enron. And so what we don't talk about though, or that we rarely talk about in organizations, not necessarily for entrepreneurs, but in organizations, we rarely talk about the fact that you also have a brand within an organization. You are your brand. As you said, how you show up, how you talk to people, what words you use. When you are using politics, right? Are you manipulating people, or is there intent? Are you trying to persuade and influence, or are you trying to browbeat people? And so there's that whole idea of brand that's also tied to this relationship building, because those relationships help you solidify that brand and understand what that brand is. Like you said, that question, what does it feel like to be on the other side of me and the other
Well, and
side of how I want to be known?
I'll share this with you, and you know this, Laurel, about my background, that I came out of a world of risk management.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's so interesting when we hear companies talk about the concept of risk management. They talk about it in
Mm-hmm.
corporate terms, they talk about it in
Yes.
sort of business cycle or supply chain risk or trade risk, currency risk, in some cases, weather risk and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And when we talk about personal relationships, what's at stake with personal relationships is reputational risk.
Yes.
And when
Yes.
we make that connection and we think about, okay, how do I show up every day? How do I show up with my team? How do I show up with
Mm-hmm.
executives?
Mm-hmm.
Your reputational risk, again, also is in play every day.
Yeah.
And
Every
this is
day.
why when we talk about this concept of executive presence, does somebody
Mm-hmm.
have executive presence? Thinking out loud as a senior executive has such consequences to it,
Yes.
because the
Yes.
higher you go, the greater you are at risk of damaging your reputation when you start thinking out loud, or you just start perhaps even
Yes.
blurting out things that,
Yes.
we tell our 3-year-olds this sometimes about, hey, that's your inside voice. Well, sometimes when
Right.
we're adults, we forget what our inside voice is. And
We
next thing you
do.
know, we've got a reputational problem that was created
Yes.
because we chose not to show up in a way that was uh, thoughtful about
Yes.
what was just said.
Right. Right. And and it's so interesting that you say that because when I was at Deloitte, we did enterprise risk management, and one of the key pieces that we'd always talk to people about was reputational risk. It's like what are all the things that can get in the way of you achieving your objectives, right? And those are financial, they are reputational, right? The stuff that can wind up on the front of the newspaper, all of those kind of things. And I was listening to a podcast. So I love Hidden Brain, love that podcast. And I was listening to one several months ago, and they were talking about ambivalence, and and they were talking about a different definition of ambivalence in connecting it to indecisiveness, right? Like really looking at not so much I don't really, yeah, whatever, right? That kind of ambivalence, but really kind of the secondary definition of ambivalence, which is really indecisive, spending time gathering a lot of information, being able to see all the different sides before you make a decision. And so the crux of this thing was when the researchers did the research, those executives who were more ambivalent, thinking a lot, gathering more information, asking a lot of questions, being positive about things like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. That ambivalence was seen as indecisive, right? Again, kind of to your point, that processing out loud can damage a reputation of being decisive, being strong, knowing where it's going to go, having a good vision. And yet, the other side of that research said that those leaders that were ultimately seen as ambivalent actually were then seen as making some of the best decisions because they took the time to gather information, right? So when you're talking about this processing out loud as you move up the organization, I think that reputational piece becomes not necessarily about not, but when and how much and with whom, right?
Absolutely right. And I'll say this. This plays out often in executive teams and in
Mm-hmm.
boardrooms where the loudest voice wins. Or,
Yes.
when you look across an organization and you think, okay, I have I have several leaders that are on this team right now, but two or three of them control 90% of the company.
Mm-hmm.
So in meetings, if they are the sort of the prevailing voice, if you want to say that,
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Mm-hmm.
it could easily be, you could easily look at the less vocal people in the room, say, and quickly assume wrongly that
Yeah.
those people aren't really very bright because they're not really quick to sound off, or they're not good on their feet, or they. And the truth is, this is not an improv class. and
No. Right.
we're not teaching people how to, quickly say things and do things on the fly. I
Hmm.
do think that, and I love how I know Adam Grant spends a lot of time on this topic, and I love the
Hmm.
way he does because he talks
Hmm.
about sometimes the quietest person in the room is the most thoughtful and they're the most deliberate,
Yes.
and they are the processor that's able to come back
Hmm.
to the rest of the team. I All right, so I used this example the other day, and I again was with a baby boomer and a Gen X, and
Hmm.
It's the EF Hutton moment, right?
Yes.
It's the and I knew if I'd had a Gen Z in the room, or even my son had been in the room, he would have
Yeah.
been like, "Who in the world
What?
is EF
Yeah.
Hutton?"
Right.
So,
Yes.
but I mean, it's often that they don't say a lot, but when they
Yeah.
do, you can count on it being gold.
Yes. Yes. One of my dearest friends and a mentor of mine, and just she's just become family, who was a general counsel, right, for a number of companies. And we used to talk all the time about how she'd get in a meeting and like you could hear pins drop when she spoke. Pins drop. One, because she very rarely spoke. Not because she didn't have anything to say, but she didn't feel the need to always be speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Two, she was an attorney, very much an attorney, right? So she was paying attention to what was being said, and I was mindful of how she said and what she said. But the other piece was when she did choose to speak, it was always thoughtful, on point, provocative, and sometimes was really not sometimes, all the time. She had no issue calling out the elephant in the room
Mm-hmm.
clearly, concisely, without damaging other people's reputation, but also holding people accountable to say, you know what, there really is an elephant, and we're not going to pretend there's not an elephant in this room. But
Yes.
because she had developed that reputation for being clear, concise, paying attention, seeing something other people didn't see, when she spoke, it carried weight. It carried weight. And so I know it's facilitation 101. They say, right, pay attention to the people who are being quiet. Sometimes they're the only ones in the room that know something that everybody needs to know,
Yeah.
right?
No, it's so true, and you tie you tie this concept to the notion and the discipline of having psychological safety grounded in a room
Yes.
or
Mm-hmm.
grounded in an organization. Because if someone doesn't feel safe to raise their hand or just say something, and they
Right.
actually suppress a thought that could change the trajectory in a positive way of whatever the business
Mm-hmm.
issue is at hand, but
Mm-hmm.
they know that there's either going to be direct or indirect retribution if I
Mm-hmm.
say this. Uh, that's where we see executive teams sometimes, and even mid-level managers
Yeah.
get just get sideways because
Yes.
if I don't feel safe to share my opinion, or if I don't feel safe to share a perhaps contentious piece of feedback,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and if it's the right thing to do,
Yes.
that that's a that's a big caution flag of what kind of
It
culture is
is.
happening.
Absolutely. And I think as you and I have had a chance to talk, and have conversations over these last few years that we got a chance to know each other, and thinking about this whole topic of showing up in your brand and creating safe spaces, right? This psychological safety. When you are again getting leaders to really think differently about reputation and what reputation and relationship really means, right? Because again, words matter, and that word professional relationship or just having a relationship always had such ugly connotations, right? It's like the Mad Men connotation,
Yeah,
and
right.
yet, right? And yet, it is critical to your success as a leader. Leadership being about behavior, not position, right? It is critical for you to understand how to build authentic, connected, powerful, and yes, you know, plentiful and supportive and meaningful relationships in order to get where you want to be. There is a selfish mode of relationships, but if you lead in the building of those with understanding relationship means two-way, how can I also serve the person that yes, there's some selfishness in it, but I also need to serve in order to build it. there's an art to building effective relationships that support you through your career, and so kind of your board of directors. And so if we take this conversation kind of to that next step of how do you build those relationships to get your board of directors, right? The ones who are
Yeah.
really going to help you through, whether that's staying in corporate, getting out of corporate, doing a little bit of both. How do you help people who really are trying to figure out how do I put this group of folks around me that are going to tell me the truth that I can learn from and that they can learn from me to get to where I need to be, even if I don't exactly know where that is right now?
Yeah, it is such a wonderful practice to have and a discipline to create that type of board.
Hmm.
And I'll say this, that the people that you want in that circle are the folks that are going to truly give you just unadulterated truth.
Yes.
And the ones that also don't have a dog in the hunt other than helping and loving and supporting
Right.
you as a person,
Right.
as a professional. What I always tell folks is, these are the people, and I have one of these people in my life
Hmm.
that whenever I have a big decision to take, and whether it's a work decision or, and I need his perspective on it,
Hmm. Hmm.
I know that if when I take it to him, that he's going to punch me in the gut on something, or he's going to give me something alternative to
Yes.
think about. And
Yes.
there's days too, Laurel, where I look at him and I think, oh, I know what he's gonna tell me, and why did I even bring this up to him?
Right.
Uh,
Right.
and he says it, and it was the right thing to say at the right time. But I do think that if you have a bunch of people that are around you that are going to morph into groupthink and really just sort of jump
Yeah.
into jump into the boat with you and just say, yeah, great, you're awesome, you go, girl, you this, and that's not going to help.
Yeah.
That's not going to help at all. The other
No.
piece that I would say is, we've talked for centuries, thousands of years. We've talked about this idea of the golden rule.
Yes.
Now, what's the golden rule?
Hmm. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right?
Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, I think in biblical times they were absolutely right on, and
Right?
I still subscribe to that. I
Yes.
totally believe it. What I talk to people about today is this idea of the platinum rule. And what the
Mm.
platinum rule is you do unto others as they would want done unto them. Because what we're assuming in
Mm.
the golden rule is that since I like to be treated that way, you must
That's a
like to
good
be
point.
treated that way.
Yes. Yes.
And I think this whole business about, relational currency and the crux of it is
Hmm.
we spend so much time assuming that the person that's on the receiving end is going to line up with whether it's our worldview, whether it's the way in
Hmm.
which we want to be communicated with, when in fact, and
Yeah.
again, there's so many different ways to describe this. I mean, you could say it's emotional intelligence, you could say it's empathy, you could say it's just
Yeah.
being, savvy about who's on the other end of that. But I really,
Right.
over this last couple of years, I have pushed leadership teams to think deeper about, okay, are we using the platinum rule? Because if we're not really understanding what is important to that other person, and then
Right.
unknowingly, unwittingly, or perhaps even unconsciously, then we are
Right.
forcing our will on them,
Yes.
and
Yes.
that doesn't change behavior. That
No.
either forces people into submission, or in its worst case, on the other end of the extreme, it's off-putting and it repels people.
Yes. Yeah. It's like the platinum rule is almost the Witham rule, right? What's in it for me
Yeah,
on the other
that's
side?
exactly right. Absolutely
What
right.
is it that they want to? Because you're right. That is so powerful, Ash, that we often project that the underlying premise of the golden rule is that everyone wants to be treated the same way, and they don't. Now, most people, I would say, and I do say most because there are some people who just don't care, but most people want to be at least treated with dignity and respect, right?
Of course,
Um,
absolutely.
but there's some things beyond that, just like some people want FaceTime. Some people don't bother me unless you need something. Some people, want to meet with you once a month. Some people need something with you every day, right? It's that whole idea of, and I just had this conversation with a client, not trying not to try to lead or manage uniformly because people aren't uniform. You've got to
Yes.
manage to what people's needs are within reason and be consistent, not the same. And I don't know why it's so hard for leaders to understand that treating people consistently is not the same as treating people the same. And the
Yes.
power is in consistency, not in sameness.
And it's no different than delivering the same message to two different people,
Mm-hmm.
and you can still get your point across, and you can still get the salient points across
Yes.
with with just even slightly, in some cases, adapting style or delivery or even mode of communication in that. And that's,
Yeah.
we're talking about having now five generations in the workforce. What do we have? We've got
Yes.
baby boomers, we got X, we've got millennial, Gen Z,
Z. And
and we
then this
still
new
have
one.
some. Yeah,
Yeah.
this new. I don't even know what we're calling.
They're calling.
What the,
Yeah.
and there are still some, Warren Buffetts in the world that are in the mature
Yes.
category. So it's,
Yes.
we have multiple generations of people who want to, at their core, want to do
Mm-hmm.
the right thing. They want
Right.
to show up every day and make a difference in their community, or make a difference in their nonprofit, or make a difference in their business.
Right.
Um, but they require a
Yeah.
different level of relational treatment.
Absolutely. And if there's one thing that the pandemic also brought to the forefront is those folks who are really great leaders, right? Really great managers, um, were able to adapt and do the same in this. The ones who weren't, that were continued to be protected by their businesses, who were kind of like, well, that's just how they are. That's just their poor skill in this area was exponentially more impactful when they had to learn how to actually, I don't know, talk to people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Over a phone. They had to actually check in with people that weren't sitting in their face. It was very telling. If we think about the pandemic, try to think about it objectively, there were some, it's been very, very difficult. And there are some things that were brought to light that I think have been around for a very long time that we were faced with, that leaders were faced with, that corporations were faced with, that were not new, but they could really no longer, with integrity, say they didn't know. It was so blatant, right? So blatant. And so helping those leaders understand when you're talking about reputation
Yeah.
and building your brand, part of that is also recognition when you have an issue on your team and addressing that. That doesn't mean, you know, cutting off people's head with a guillotine in the street all the time so everybody knows what the problem is. That's not what that means. But it does mean addressing it in a way that people understand what is and is not acceptable. Because you teach people will listen to what you say, but they will believe what you do. And
Yes.
if you
Agreed.
tolerate madness, then they're going to believe that madness is okay.
Well, and that's where toxic cultures unfortunately get more toxic,
Mm-hmm.
or worse. You end
Mm-hmm.
up pushing out stars or potential
Yes.
stars that could
Yes.
contribute at a strong level, at a good level.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree.
One thing you made me think about, Laurel, on this is, and it's so fascinating because I've got an 18-year-old son who, he's involved in all these Discord groups, and different group chats and this
Mm-hmm.
and that, and
Oh
then
yeah.
I don't disparage any of it. I think I think for that generation, and even a couple other
It,
generations,
absolutely.
that's the way these guys communicate, and
Yeah.
I don't disparage any of them for that. What's interesting to me is when I think about email and text and social media, and just the nuances of communication that get
Mm-hmm.
missed, and
Yes.
it is funny because every once in a while, my son will tell me, oh yeah, so and so is just going nuts on Discord and that, and it's funny
Yeah.
because we don't really, when you take it out of Discord or out of email or out of text,
Yes.
and I've even told Will before, hey, why don't you send a note out on the Discord server that says, hey, take it out of chat. Why don't we talk on the phone?
Yeah.
You
I
know?
can.
And it's so great
Right.
because you really can't develop relationships effectively via
Right.
text or through these. I mean, these modern conveniences that we have
Yeah.
are great. I mean,
Yes.
they serve their purpose, but when it
Yeah.
truly comes to, okay, do I know that person? Do they know me? Do
Yeah.
are we building just good, authentic relationships versus these
Yeah.
tangential, superficial ones? I do believe that my son's generation, and even the millennials for that matter,
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
grew up with that technology,
Yeah.
that's going to be a pressure point for them
Yeah.
uh, to get to
Yeah.
that point.
Yeah. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that changes over time, right? Because what hit me, and I think this is like a perfect piece of ending this conversation is your point is so poignant in that I've always said, from a communication perspective, face to face, then ear to ear, then email, text, blah, 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 right? Because you do lose context, tone of voice. Oh, so many things can be misconstrued. But what hit me as you were, not but, and what hit me as you were talking, generational and differences and not generational differences is I wonder from an evolutionary perspective if at any point in time we will actually get better at being able to be clearer and more authentic and more connected through technology, right? I wonder if,
Mm,
like, now we got video, so it's at least a little bit easier, but I wonder if
sure.
our evolutionary process is either going to lose our connection and the nuance and the tone and all of the things that make us human, or if it's actually going to morph and modify and evolve so that we actually can be just as effective at some point with this new technology. I just wonder. I probably will be dead before we
Yeah.
do that, but I wonder.
Well, it's funny you bring it up though. So, I mean, in the middle of the pandemic, when everybody was on Teams calls, and we still are, I mean, Zoom and
Yeah.
Teams and WebEx and all that, it was very telling to me when when you would be on a call and no one on the call had their camera on,
Yeah. Yeah.
and not that, I mean,
Right.
that one I find a little bit comical because what would
Yeah.
you have done if you had actually had to go to the office? Would you have put a bag over your head? No,
Right.
of course not. You would. Of course you wouldn't have. But I mean,
Right.
it's just so very telling that here we have an opportunity through technology. And again, I know people have had to get used to it, and
Yeah. Yeah.
there's a certain level of engagement on camera that maybe people
Yes.
find
Yeah.
clunky and awkward. But
Right.
we have those opportunities today, um, and the shyest of the shy, or perhaps the most introverted folks, are always going to be like, you know
Yeah.
what, I just, or I'm feeding my pet or folding my laundry or
Right.
whatever I'm
Right.
doing,
Right.
or
Right.
getting my kid to go eat breakfast or
Exactly.
whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Multitasking. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. 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 It's going to be interesting to see what happens over time, I think. But I think at the end of the day, as well, and why I wanted to have this conversation with you is no matter what the evolution is of the mechanism, right, or the tactics, what I don't think is going to change and don't believe is going to change. Unless I guess if you watch Star Wars and I Am Legend, all that kind of stuff, right? What I don't believe is going to change is that need for human connection and relationship building as we become and develop our leadership skills. We've got to learn to connect, build that support system, build relationships that are, yes, some in some cases maybe selfish, but are also service oriented, that are full circle, that give grace, right, to each other, and are built with like compassion and purpose. And so I am so appreciative that you agreed to come back on to Fireside and talk about this issue, because this whole idea of relationships and relationships in leadership, I think, is something that is not talked about enough in a way that
It's
is accessible.
we don't teach it enough, and
Mm,
honestly, I mean, I'm a believer that this is the kind of stuff that even needs to be taught in high school and even
I
before you get
agree.
to college, or if you go to college, but even
Hmm.
before you leave high school, just this
Hmm.
idea of, boy, what is my, I mean, everyone has a network, whether you
Yes.
call it that or not.
Right.
Everyone has a stable of relationships that they have.
Hmm.
Now, how strong they are and how developed they are, how curated or cultivated they
Right.
are, that's varying degrees for everyone. But
Yeah.
I tell people that relationships are what makes the world go round. And it's not
Yes.
it's not in an opportunistic way, but
Mm-mm.
there's power in knowing that you and I have a mutual friend in the diplomatic corps, so that if we ever had a question that was
Yes.
diplomacy related, we would know to go to this guy. and
Exactly.
and again, that's just through cultivation over time.
Yeah.
And I,
Yeah.
I don't think well, our busyness gets in the way
Hmm.
of really strengthening this muscle.
Yes. We wear busyness as a badge. We got to stop. We've got to
Yeah,
stop.
I mean,
So
multitasking is a highly overrated skill to have.
it is. It is. It is. And all the research says that nobody ever really multitasks. We just do multiple things poorly. Right? We
Well,
just.
it's funny you bring it up. So I follow a guy named Nir Ayal, and
Mhm.
Nir talks about this idea of multitasking is the equivalent of you switching on a light, switching it off, switching it on, switching it off on each
Yep.
task that you are
Yes.
trying to
Yep.
multitask on, and the recovery period to get productive back to the task that you
Hmm.
just switched off and then switched on could be as much as 23 minutes. Now,
Absolutely.
I don't have that much time in the day if I'm multitasking.
I know. Right? And the older I get, I think that switch off time gets just a little bit longer each time to
Yeah.
gear the brain back up to refocus. So, well, I'm so appreciative of everybody coming. I know Frankie had some challenges with tech, so hopefully he'll be able to catch the replay. Woody, thank you so much for jumping back in. I know there's some amazing shows every day, so people often bounce back in and try to see as many shows as they can. So, Ash, thank you so much for being here again. I so appreciate it. This is such an important conversation to have, and I know we will get a chance to have it again. For those of you who are on Fireside, thank you for tuning into Alignment Vision Action every Wednesday for at 7 o'clock Central for now, right, for the show. And then once a month, we actually do a show midday, early in the month, midday for Empowerment Village. And the next one is going to be, I think, on October the 12th. It'll be at noon Central Time for Empowerment Village, and we'll chit chat about some things, all things empowerment at that show. So thank you all for watching. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for catching the replay. And as you have comments or questions or ideas around this idea of relationships and leadership, please send them to me, DM, send a note on the replay. I'd really appreciate it. Ash, thank you again for being here. You guys go follow Ash. He's on Fireside. He's on LinkedIn, Ash Merchant. And he is with Lionheart Partners, and you will see his bio in the notes of the show on the replay. So thank you all for being here. We are going to let everyone go and spend the rest of their evening. Ash, thank you for spending your
Thank
time.
you, Laurel. So good to be on the show again.